Good morning, everyone. This is a little loud. My name is Arthur Melzer, together with my co-conspirator, who has just returned, Dustin Siebel. I'd like to welcome you to the first panel of our two-day conference entitled Liberalism and its Discontents. But first, a brief word from our sponsors. This conference is brought to you by the Political Science Department's LeFrak Forum on Science, Reason, and Modern Democracy, now in its 33rd year. It is partly supported by funds from the LeFrak Foundation of New York, as well as a We the People grant from the National Endowment for Humanities. I'd like to begin with just a few brief introductory reflections about the topic of our conference. But we will extend this session to 11:15 just to ensure that our speakers will receive every one of their promised minutes. Our world of liberal modernity emerged in the Enlightenment, growing primarily from the philosophically derived ideals of liberalism, representative democracy, and market-based commercial society. In the following centuries, this movement slowly spread around the globe, generating unprecedented levels of prosperity, stability, individual liberation, and freedom from violence. In the face of such truly extraordinary success, it is necessary to begin by asking whether it is not simply an act of ingratitude, not to say spoiledness, that brings us all here today to display and debate our discontents. Perhaps we should redub the event Liberalism and its Malcontents. But what must also be kept in mind is that essentially from the Enlightenment's very beginning, it has been shadowed by the counter-Enlightenment. That is to say, by a continually reasserted discontent with modernity arising from within the modern camp itself. Only 61 years separate Locke's second treatise from Rousseau's first discourse. In different eras, this stubborn discontent has expressed itself in widely different forms: romanticism, communism, existentialism, populism, fascism, postmodernism. But these varied discontents, while having their own very separate histories, nevertheless all have, I think, this in common. They are all revolts against what I would propose to call the voluntary narrowness of Enlightenment rationalism, a narrowness of both method and substance. In its driving ambition to change and rationalize the world and to vanquish its enemy, the Church, the Enlightenment strove for a new philosophical simplicity and rigor. It aimed at the ability to issue a proclamation of self-evident, actionable, and morally urgent principles in the hope that this would give it a new political force and relevance. In short, it voluntarily narrowed its views in order to sharpen them, to weaponize them. Similarly, on the level of substance, voluntary narrowness, now under the name of limited government, is essentially the defining principle of liberalism. For limited government means not only constraining political authority institutionally through the separation and balance of powers, but it also means, and more fundamentally, it means limiting the whole end and function and purpose of the state down to the protection of life, liberty, and property, that is to say, to the few most basic, obvious, and urgent goods of life. Thus, it means removing from the state's jurisdiction and responsibility all the nobler ends of life, such as the fulfillment of our souls or their salvation. For these higher ends are inherently unclear and controversial, and thus they have proven through long experience to pose a very great obstacle to long-term peace and stability. Indeed, the political role of these ends was seen at the time of the Enlightenment as the primary source of the West's long history of failed states. The counter-Enlightenment, in all its profuse and confusing variety, represents the revolt of all these excluded ends. The Romantics, for example, rebelled on behalf of our amorous and erotic needs, our longing for enchantment, against a world that seemed to recognize only material needs, while the existentialists decried the loss in a society built on the right to preservation of an authentic reckoning with the inescapability of death. So it seems in some that we here are not simply late modern malcontents. At a minimum, we are part of a long tradition, and we do seem to have ample good reason to feel dissatisfaction with the liberal state, for the simple reason that the liberal state, with its limited government, is and is meant to be disappointing and discontenting, since this is the necessary condition of political health and stability. But for all that, it does not mean to eliminate these higher goods, just privatize them. So then, the true questions before us today are these: can new and better ways be found for cultivating these higher goods within the private realm? And after a very good search, if the answer is no, then the second question is there any reason to believe that we could, within today's hyper-pluralist society, reintroduce these higher ends into the political sphere without also reintroducing all the grave political turmoil and conflict that caused us to turn to liberalism in the first place? Turning now to the subject of the present panel, its specific charge is this: looking back to the origins of looking back to the origins of liberalism, on what theoretical foundations does it rest? Are they sturdy enough to support the edifice of liberalism? Our speakers, in order of appearance, are Harvey C. Mansfield, the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard University, Bryan Garsten, Professor of Political Science and Humanities at Yale University, and Eric Nelson, Robert M. Barron, Professor of Government at Harvard University. Each will speak for about 20 minutes, after which we will open the floor for discussion. Thank you. Professor Mansfield.
I would usually begin by thanking you for the introduction and by telling a joke, but there's no time for that. In fact, that was the joke. And I would like to express my thankful appreciation for anticipating a part, a good part, or even the whole of my remarks. So I've got a title called Liberalism and the Common Good. And I'm going to talk about the new common good, conservatism. The new conservatism that is very, or even mainly opposed to neoconservatism. Conservatism that has lost patience with liberalism, a new conservatism that neglects, ignores both hyper-partisanship and normal partisanship. So I'm first going to discuss the common good and then the nature of liberalism. Liberalism in the generic sense, that's a society of rights. That's opposed to the people who are today called liberals, both of which, both liberals and conservatives today, are joined under a society of rights. Rights allow these today's liberals and the common good conservatives say, and promote and encourage them. So today's liberals become the winners, and today's conservatives always lose. It's time to seek, therefore, a way to gain permanent victories over today's liberals, as this group of today's conservatives say. To rule. Common good, it seems, is associated with rule, as opposed to representation, which is associated with liberalism. Integral or common good conservatism is not content with representing diversity, by which conservatives lose. So the common good conservatives say that today's liberals are the necessary consequence of generic liberalism. So to attack the former, today's liberals, conservatives must abandon generic liberalism. Should we go back to Thomas Aquinas for the common good? A good number of these common good conservatives are traditional Catholics. But if we do go back to Thomas Aquinas, we find him speaking of the philosopher, Aristotle. So let's talk about Aristotle. There are several people, I think, in this audience from whom I could borrow my thoughts on Aristotle and the common good, but I want to mention a book by my late wife, Delma Winthrop, called Aristotle, Democracy and Political Science, of which the following remarks are a simplification. From Politics, Book 3, Chapters 6 to 7. There you find two definitions of the common good, which is called common benefit. And Aristotle speaks of the common benefit and the benefit in common. Benefit is sum for all, it means a bringing together. And you can have common as an adjective describing this benefit or good. And you can have it as a noun used in the dative, benefit in common. So those two translations, common benefit and benefit in common. And when they bring together things, they bring together in rule, archy, bringing along by rule. Now, what is the difference between these two definitions? Common benefit. That's what individuals have in common, more or less equally. Each of us and all of us having a body. This definition is essentially democratic. We all equally have a body, from which one could infer that all should rule, or all should rule in turn. All of us have the matter of a private body, and all of us, quote, matter, unquote. All lives matter. What matters most about us is our matter. So democracy seems to be based on materialism, which is what we most have in common, our bodies, as the democracy that we like. Democracy is not a necessary consequence of materialism. And we have a democratic despotism of the majority, or of a single person over the majority, a democratic dictator. So that's common benefit. Now, benefit in common. Benefit in common is not the many who are all equal, but the few who are better in some way and contribute more to the whole. The best, athletes, artists, professors, statesmen. These people contribute more to the whole because the many, and here with the second definition, the distinction between few and many comes in, enjoy watching, listening, studying, prospering We participate in this second common good, but we do so unequally. In this way of understanding leads to a political inference of oligarchy, of aristocracy, a government of the few. It's based on the soul. We are superior souls, superior in intellect. Compare Aristotle and Hegel with an ordinary moron, a tremendous difference. Talents which are not intellectual but point to the intellect. As the best athletes give others appetite for the best, for quality. You could be mistaken as to what is best. Hence, despotism is also possible under aristocracy. Cheering for the home team is an example of the democratization of the best, an example of the benefit in common, an aristocratic aspect of our democracy. But Aristotle doesn't simply choose the latter, benefit in common, but he rather goes for both definitions. We need to recognize both. Common good is in a mix of the two. Materialism of the body can be slavish, but materialism can also be freedom-loving. When you defend your life, it seems that your matter matters. Self-preservation, the liberal principle, leads to the right of self-defense. Thus, in which you risk your life. Even the right to kill, which Hobbes says is a consequence of the right to life, implies a situation in which you might die yourself. The superiority of the soul needs to know about the claims of bodily passions to rule us. How is it possible to control passions? You can't ignore bodies if you want the common good. But it's very difficult, perhaps impossible, to maintain both definitions of the common good. There's always a bias toward one or the other. All regimes are either democracy or oligarchy. So regimes rule in accordance with something common. Democracy rules for a democratic way of life. It doesn't tolerate inequality unless it is disguised or democratized. But it can be moderated if that happens. Rule is tyrannical as such, or in practice, for liberals, particularly the rule of the church. So the rebellion in the 16th and 17th centuries established liberalism. How could we avoid rule? We can do so by a government that is by consent, a representative government that acts for the people without ruling the people. How is this possible? With the notion of rights. Individual rights, inalienable rights. All citizens have a right to consent. The common good, then, is the common benefit, only or mainly Aristotle's first definition. All individuals start out free in the state of nature. That's natural freedom, which is unlimited but insecure. And it is made secure with government to secure these rights, says the Declaration. Freedom is limited but is now secure. Government secures rights, individuals exercise them. Government has a character enabling citizens to choose how to live. It doesn't impose a way of life. The public sphere serves the private sphere, known as civil society. The end of life is unspecified. The pursuit of happiness as individual, not in common. All of us have common protection from the government, but no common good is specified. So we escape the oppression from rule, from imposing a way of life on society, rather than representing society's choices of how to live. John Locke, in his letter on toleration, said,
that the magistrate cares for bodies, not for your soul. That is generic liberalism. The result is that liberalism has an empty center, a phrase I owe to another dear friend, Joseph Krause, another dear friend who's not here. Liberalism has an empty center in its basic structure, the empty center which is called civil society. It's reflected in the distinction that we make in America between constitutional law and ordinary law. The Constitution is securing rights for all. Ordinary law, it consists of society's choices within civil society. So the Constitution is limited government, which means no rule. Basic structure is formal, meaning that it does not specify a particular content, a definition of happiness that would be the common good. So liberalism, I think, stands or falls with its formality. Can this formality be maintained? Well, the thing is that the empty center won't remain empty. Nature abhors a vacuum. And there are two ways in which this empty center is filled. First, the empty center is a sphere of choice to be exercised. And so that's what citizens are left free to do. But when citizens make their choices, those choices then limit later choices. Choice is limited by what has been chosen. Chosen becomes an establishment, a status quo that has to be taken into account by later choices. Do you want to keep or change the status quo? You can't return to a zero base. So the empty center never appears in liberalism once liberalism has been established. Just as with landed property in a settled territory, there are no vacant lots that nobody owns. And second, the empty center is filled by what we call the private sphere, by the family and economy, and also the public. Officially, the public is established by the private sphere because the public comes out of private choice by a social contract. Actually, the public endorses and manages private choices. Securing rights requires deciding how and for what they will be exercised. So we find that the public is divided into parties, left and right. This is the partisanship of the common good, denied or underestimated by common good conservatism, but not by liberalism, which has a place for it. John Locke, the supreme philosopher of liberalism, is known for his arguments on behalf of toleration, or free speech, that's in the letter on toleration, and for private property in chapter 5 of the second treatise. The first right of free speech appeals to intellectuals. The second of private property to businessmen. That is, there's something for the left and something for the right. So Locke unites the two partisan tendencies of liberalism, later divided by Rousseau and all other enemies of the bourgeoisie, which there were many. Liberalism has two weaknesses that give rise to left and right. Its principle of a fundamental right of self-preservation is too selfish, lacking in the sense of common good, in the sense of community. This is the left. And self-preservation is also too ignoble and mean, lacking in an appeal to human nobility and ambition. And this is attacked by the right. For the left, Marx is the chief spokesman. For the right, Nietzsche. You knew this, didn't you? Now, each party under liberalism restores something of Aristotle's notion of rule. People say today that they don't want to impose their view on others, but in fact they do this when they vote. In the abortion controversy, we have right to choose versus right to life. Two rights under generic liberalism. But each wants a society ruled by its principle. Moreover, in general, each party stands for one of Aristotle's two definitions of the common good. Democrats for inclusiveness, the common good as uniting equal individuals. Republicans for some making a greater contribution than others, as for example Mitt Romney when he spoke of givers versus takers. I've got 40% takers in our society. That's a danger. And so Republicans are the party of the few. They live in a democratic era, however, so they have to make their divisive principle democratic, as they try to do. The principle of earning or contributing, which any free worker can accomplish, over the principle of taking or seeking. Neither party wins permanently as long as society remains free under liberalism. Neither deserves to win permanently. The two ways of understanding human nature as a whole of individuals and as a whole of better and worse are both correct and both opposed. Yet they must be combined somehow in every society. Liberalism is not the only way to do this, but it is the best way available. It requires that each party make way for the other when it loses, and that each resists the attempt to annihilate the other. I conclude with two remarks on the hyper-partisanship of the present. First, liberalism thrives when it respects and nourishes the distinctions and formal differences of community life, as opposed to overcoming them by politicizing every separate activity. Partisanship needs to be kept within bounds, so that the temptation to want to rule others is restricted. Businesses and universities should not display partisanship, much less require it of customers and students. Having an art or a profession gives you protection against being wholly defined by your racial or sexual identity. And the same is true of, say, athletic excellence. You shouldn't feel obliged to marry a fellow partisan or to live in the same neighborhood with one. Second, an observation of Yuval Levin's. Our politics, like John Locke's, has a culture issue and an economic issue. The culture issue is what I call the second definition of Aristotle's common good, and the economic issue the first. And each of our parties addresses both those issues. Conservatives care more for the culture issue, where they think they are losing, and liberals care more for the economic issue, where they think they are losing. Thus, both parties forget where they are winning and think mainly of where they are losing. This is very true of the common good conservatives. Both of our parties forget their indebtedness to our tried and true liberalism, which gives them partial victories dimmed by partial defeats. Both strive to put an end to the fun and zest of politics and to the prudent halfway blessing of liberalism that keeps us free. Liberalism welcomes sports fans, but doesn't insist that you have to be one in order to be a good citizen. And it congratulates women who are mothers, but doesn't blame those who aren't. Thank you.
morning, everyone. I also want to thank Professor Dustin Siebel and Harvey Melzer for the invitation. I do notice they've put the Harvard Yale types up here in front of everyone, in front of the firing squad, first thing in the morning to be disposed of right away. To get rid of the coastal, East Coast elites, anyway. It's a Machiavellian move. Harvey should appreciate. I also admit, after having thanked you, that I feel set up a bit by the question you proposed about the foundations of liberalism. Liberalism as an edifice, which must be able, the word implies, I think, to stand on its own. This framing suggests that liberals mean to offer a self-sufficient way of life, or a total philosophy, or ideology to replace the alternatives. And therefore that we face, in a way, a fundamental choice between what liberals offer, liberals in the broad sense, and alternatives, which I suppose are religion or socialism or community. And in that sort of comparison, liberalism will only fare well if we love liberty at the expense of all other goods. Without wanting to be pedantic, I do want to mention that this framing, and even the word liberalism, with the ism attached, was invented to create precisely this impression, invented as an accusation. First, it seems, by the Spanish Catholic supporters of King Ferdinand, fighting to protect the throne against revolutionary forces early in the 19th century. Isms were heresies. Both political and papal pronouncements against liberals identify them as belonging to a new and dangerous heretical sect, putting liberalism alongside Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anabaptism, and, as Eric Nelson will show us, and as Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri has also emphasized in a commencement address, Pelagianism. So I can't help but feel that asking even an apparently neutral question about the foundations of such a heresy is tilting the playing field against those who want to defend liberal societies, as if we were asked in a neutral and balanced tone, what are the theoretical foundations of devil worship? Are they sturdy enough to support the edifice of devilry? Isms in general often function as evil demons in the way we talk about politics. Isms are vaguely defined entities, shadowy forces that cannot be brought into sharp focus, but that have a dangerous vitality and agency that explain the origin of all that is bad in our world. And this is how liberalism functions in the discourse of many of my best students today, alongside other isms, racism, imperialism, and capitalism for those on the left, or individualism, secularism, and capitalism again for those on the right, or part of the right. There is a danger, I think we have to acknowledge, that the study of these occult forces will take on the character of demonology. Now, having said that, I also want to say that I share many of the concerns about the strain of thought that we often identify as the theoretical root of liberalism, the social contract tradition, which I myself have argued has a strongly anti-political character in that it aims to avoid or constrain controversies at the heart of politics, the efforts we make to persuade one another about what our common good is, what it requires. I share many of the concerns that are being voiced today about that social contract tradition, but let me come right to the heart of the matter. I'm not convinced that liberal societies, as we have them, actually succeed in putting into practice in any significant way the most extreme formulations of social contract, the radical separateness or autonomy of the self, the theoretically unlimited scope of freedom, the demand that all groupings of any kind be constructed de novo and through the explicit choice or consent of individuals. Almost to a person, we who live in liberal societies still come into the world not as isolated mushrooms popping up from the ground, but from the wombs of women, fed by their breasts, born into families and communities and towns and countries whose authority and norms most of us rather mindlessly take for granted and follow. In that context, liberals, in the broad sense again, have not conquered or even succeeded in any permanent way, but have instead been trying to offer a remedy for certain illnesses that naturally tend to arise in political bodies. Human beings living together tend to fall into rather closed tribal groups and to enforce their norms in a quiet but unforgiving way. We are mostly docile, but we can be brought occasionally to erupt into furious fanatical violence against anyone who strays from our customs. And we're usually brought to that boiling point by the incitement of some ambitious warrior or politician or preacher as a part of the more or less constant jousting that takes place amongst the princes and aspiring princes who want to wield power. We tend to be at their mercy. Liberals try to reduce this vulnerability. They are not concerned primarily with the fundamental political question of who rules. Instead, they're focused on how the ruling is being done. At least, this is the emphasis in some of the liberals I've been focusing on recently. This was one of Benjamin Constant's key points in his Principles of Politics, which focused not on the form of government in the Aristotelian sense, but on the amount of authority given to any one part of any government. His words, trust unlimited authority to one man, to several, to all, and you will still find that it is equally evil. And this is why he could work for a liberal monarchy, or a liberal republic, or a liberal democracy. For him, liberal was a modification of rule, rather than an identification of a ruler. So what exactly is this modification? The problem Constant identified with illiberal rule was, in his words, there's no means of sheltering individuals from governments. So what happens if we really emphasize Constant's idea of sheltering? Liberal societies, I want to say, in my most sympathetic mood, are those that offer refuge from the very people they empower. I'm using refuge in both a literal and a metaphorical sense, so that institutions can offer refuge. So a monarchy empowers a monarch, but it's only a liberal monarchy if it also includes parliament or a class of nobles who have real power of some kind, so that a citizen who falls out of the good graces of the present king can take refuge under the protection of this or that aristocrat or constituency. Montesquieu captured the idea when distinguishing monarchy from despotism. A democracy empowers the people, maybe, or the people who can persuasively claim to speak for the majority. But it is only a liberal democracy if it also offers refuge from them. There may be no resisting the majority in the long run, in the long term, as Tocqueville seems to have thought. But in a liberal democracy, you can find a host of power centers outside the centralized representative state authority, centers that will offer significant shelter from whatever version of popular sovereignty is reigning at any particular moment. Checks and balances, yes. Federalism. Courts enforcing the refuge offered by certain enumerated rights. Also, in civil society, churches, associations of different kinds. Also, the refuge that the concentrations of wealth can provide, private universities, private enterprises. A religion empowers people too. Priests, most obviously. Religion is liberal if it offers refuge from them. They may still serve for most religious people as authoritative guides through life's key moments, but abuses by priests are not unknown, even in our time. A liberal religion provides other sects or denominations or congregations or sacred books themselves, or ultimately one's own conscience as places of refuge of some kind. Notice that I don't say, as some liberals are tempted to, that the rulers in liberal societies do not rule. They do. Perhaps sometimes the countervailing powers I am pointing to might successfully challenge the rule, but I think it's an overstatement to suggest that the back and forth of political controversy eliminates or diffuses rule so much that it becomes mere governance, though it often hides behind a cloud of representation. The language of offering refuge is limited and defensive, therefore. It does not convey a competition to become a ruler. Liberals speak up for the desire not to be ruled, a desire that surges at certain moments in political life when we find ourselves in danger of being crushed by the battles for glory or influence among the ambitious people who tend to cause the most damage. liberal societies tend not to produce many refugees fleeing elsewhere because they offer refuge of different kinds within those societies. So a liberal society produces no exodus. Now I can hear as I speak how confused this would leave some of my favorite students. How does the idea of refuge that I'm insisting on bear on the criticisms they most often cite? For example, liberals are generally friendly to capitalism and accepting of the inequality it produces, at least to some extent. What has refuge to do with that? Fair question. I'll try to get to the heart of it. Critics of the market say, true human value lies in people, in the relationships they have with one another, in the work they do, things they make that are useful and beautiful. Perhaps true value lies in places too, in the land itself, in forests and lakes, and the buildings people have built, and the crops and animals they raise and live next to. Why, except for convenience and a greed for accumulating things that won't spoil, would we translate these genuine sorts of value into something as abstract and insubstantial as money? Here I follow Montesquieu, not the famous argument that commerce softens mores, but another argument that is at least as important in the spirit of the laws. His point, commerce allows us to protect at least some value from the depredations of the powerful. This is commerce as flight from sovereigns, capital as refuge. Consider Montesquieu's account of how commerce penetrated barbarism in Europe. He noted that medieval schoolmen who combined the Gospels with a few lines from Aristotle to condemn lending money at interest, leaving banking to those in society who were beneath contempt. The Jews, my people, met the demand and made themselves rich from it. Princes then plundered the Jews to get their accumulated wealth. And what comes next is what I want to emphasize, as Montesquieu tells it. They, the Jews, invented letters of exchange, and in this way commerce was able to avoid violence and maintain itself everywhere, for the richest trader had only invisible goods, which could be sent everywhere and leave no trace anywhere. He goes on, the Jews, proscribed by each country in turn, found the means for saving their effects, and that way they managed to fix their refuges forever. But even if we grant this view of commerce as a kind of seeking refuge, isn't it merely a kind of running away? What guidance does this offer for positively constituting society? Let me read from another key chapter in Montesquieu, a short and strange chapter titled simply, and therefore definitively, On Peoples Who Have Engaged in Economic Commerce. Without explanation, he begins the chapter this way. Marseille, the French city, Marseille, a necessary retreat in the midst of a stormy sea. Marseille, where all the winds, shoals, and the coastline order ships to put in, was frequented by seafaring people. He soon summarizes his point in the same chapter. It has been seen everywhere that violence and harassment have brought forth economic commerce among men who are constrained to hide in marshes, on islands, on the shoals, and even among dangerous reefs. Thus were Tyre, Venice, and the Dutch towns founded. Fugitives found security there. They had to live. They drew their livelihood from the whole universe. Now, I used to read this chapter following Pierre Manon as an example of how purely negative the commercial impulse is. Nothing but escape, fleeing, no positive realization of a natural human capacity. A deep criticism of liberalism's fundamental emptiness. But that reading, it seems to me, ignores the fact that seeking refuge leads in the passage to the founding of cities. Those cities were no longer fleeing, they were no longer seeking refuge, they were offering it. Emphasizing this political function of commerce might help to answer a challenge put to liberals from both left and right. Do liberals provide us with any criterion for judging how much accumulation, how much commodification or marketization, how much trade is appropriate? The usual view is that liberals simply value liberty and abstract freedom, and therefore can do little but offer a rationalization for unprincipled, unrestrained accumulation. But if a fundamental liberal function of private property, trade, finance is to offer refuge, then we could use that purpose to evaluate the proper extent of commercial activity in particular moments and situations. I haven't yet worked out the implications. This way of thinking might well allow for significant amount of accumulation, since it takes substantial concentrations of capital to offer meaningful refuge from the centralized wealth and authority of modern states. But it's also clear that concentrations of capital can themselves become the princely powers from which we need refuge. And so a liberal looks to produce some sort of dynamic balancing among these kinds of princes, political and business, so that the rest of us have the best chance of finding shelter from any one of them under the protection of some other one. I have touched on capitalism. I want to look briefly at one other common criticism of liberals through the lens offered by the idea of refuge. You might say, this talk of refuge is just new language for the emancipation that liberals always glorify. What is to keep us from wanting refuge from ordinary moral obligations and communal responsibilities? Won't the offer of refuge, just as much as the promise of freedom, suck us away from the truest sources of meaning and happiness in life? Our families, our hometowns, our churches and synagogues, mosques. Won't it draw us into the elite colleges and coastal cities where we are doomed to discover the moral and spiritual emptiness and frivolity of modern life, to feel the lonely rootlessness that will, in the end, make us a part of the masses ripe for recruitment by a demagogue to some new totalitarian dream? But I think speaking of refuge instead of merely freedom puts pressure on this argument because it forces us to move more slowly, to explain more carefully exactly how the mere availability of refuge outside our home communities dissolves those communities. Does the mere availability of alternate churches necessarily weaken our commitment to our home? Does the mere availability of divorce weaken our commitment to our marriages? It's not a rhetorical question, it's a real question. It was a key issue for anti-liberals in France early in the 19th century. Louis de Bonald, Joseph de Maistre wrote tracts on divorce. Perhaps it's true that if we live in a marketplace of possibilities, we may be more likely to look around for better options, but will we always actually be lured away? The logic of the anti-liberal worry seems to be a logic of temptation. Liberals seduce us away from our homes. They tempt us with the idea that even ordinary parts of life, subjection to the authority of a parent or teacher or minister, are threats from which we could find refuge. And the temptation seems always more powerful in us than the love of what we have and what we know. Focusing on refuge forces us to acknowledge that liberals don't actively steal people away from their families and communities, they simply offer a place to go outside of them. Why is that offer alone so corrosive? The idea seems to be that liberals amplify the voices in our heads that we should least trust, those demons tempting us into dreams of unlimited freedom and power, egoism and pride. But notice the assumptions about human nature that lie at the base of this anti-liberalism. The assumption that we do not naturally tend to stay in meaningful social or communal lives if we have another choice. That we are naturally political only if there's no other option tempting us. That with a window opened, we tend to scatter into the air like sand in the wind. This is precisely the reverse of the usual view. The anti-liberals seem to be the ones who think humans are spontaneously individualistic, and therefore must not be given the chance to choose. The liberals are the ones who think individuals are naturally political, in the sense that they will mostly tend to stay in place in their communities and pursue their lives much as they always have. The liberals say, with Locke, people are not so easily got out of their old forms as some are apt to suggest. And liberals are the ones who assume that if people do find themselves, for one reason or another, having to seek refuge from their natural communities, they will, in relatively short order, start the work of producing new ones, new associations, new communities, new families, even new religious sects, as human beings seem to have done at every time and place that we know of. To be clear, this is not to say that liberals think humans are naturally good, just that they naturally fall into political communities, and then, just as reliably, produce a predictable set of political dangers from which some of them may need to seek refuge. So, to if forced to answer the assigned question, I guess I would say, just to provoke discussion, that the theoretical foundations of liberal politics, the way I've described them, are that man is naturally political in the sense that he naturally tends to remain in communities, that if he is forced into exile, he is capable of building new communities and new ways of life that do have moral and spiritual meaning. That in most communities, a small number of ambitious and powerful warriors and demagogues tend to rise up and compete with one another for rule, leaving the rest of us at their mercy. And against the backdrop of those theoretical foundations, setting up societies that offer internal refuge for the very people they empower is an act, I want to say, not of weakness or moral ambivalence or negativity or decadence, but an act of fatherly generosity, hospitality, and magnanimity. Offering refuge is an act that can come only from strength, even from a kind of superiority. Offering refuge is something admirable, something to aspire to and admire, something noble.
I'll project. Anyway, thank you, first of all, to Arthur, to Dustin, and Lauren for organizing all of this. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to make sure not to speak for too long so that there's enough time for questions and discussion. So I'm going to give a sketch. Like Bryan, I'm going to jump off from the explicit wording of the question and note that I think it contains a really fruitful ambiguity because it asks, well, what are the foundations, theoretical foundations of liberalism, and then are they sturdy enough to support the edifice of liberalism? And you can take that second question in two very different senses. So the first would be a question about whether, as it were, the premises of the arguments in favor of liberalism, in fact, deliver their conclusions. That's to say, is it coherent as an intellectual system? Can the arguments bear the conclusions that they aim to defend? So that's a kind of philosophical question. And then you could understand it rather differently as an empirical sociological question, or a question of political psychology. That's to say, is liberalism, however you want to understand it, suitable or operable as a public philosophy, as a sort of organizing set of principles that people will buy into and will be sufficient to produce social stability and political commitment in individuals over time. Those are obviously two fascinating questions. I'm going to talk about the first. Although I think that the first has important implications for the second. So the first, like Bryan, I am very mindful of the degree to which, when we use the term liberalism to talk about anything before the beginning of the 19th century, we're making use of an anachronism. However, I think it's a sort of inescapable anachronism in that we have an entirely sensible and justifiable desire to look into the origins of the set of commitments that were later, as a cluster, identified as liberal commitments. And these are things like religious toleration, freedoms of expression and speech, the rule of law, and so on. And one of the things that I want to try to focus on is the degree to which the defense of these commitments itself is the result of what contemporary philosophers would call an overlapping consensus. That's to say, there are very, very different grounds that people have invoked over time to defend these commitments. Not just different, but often quite in conflict with each other, if not actually contradictory or incommensurable. And I want to talk in particular about two. One having to do with the formative period in which these commitments began to be defended in the early modern period. And then I want to try to very briefly draw a contrast between that set of intellectual philosophical commitments and the anthropology underlying them, that is the sort of understanding theory of the human person, what kind of thing a human being is. Between this earlier set of philosophical moods and commitments and one that is much more modern and is associated above all with what's become of liberal political philosophy in roughly the last 60 or 70 years. And so that will be my remit, and I'm going to move very quickly with the hope that we can get into some of this in question. So, in essence, I want to begin with a sort of assertion, which I'll try to make sense of, and that is that although even in the early modern period, the commitments that we have in mind, something like religious toleration, was defended on multiple grounds. The motive, the sort of primary motor behind the sort of this cluster of political institutions and practices that were being defended, which are later to be recognized as distinctively liberal, was theological in origins, and that is that in particular it is the result of philosophers and theologians meditating on the problem of theodicy. And I want to just say a little bit about how I think that worked. So the theodicy question begins ultimately from the famous dilemma set out in the Euthyphro that you're all familiar with. That is, so in the dialogue about what is pious, the question arises, is something pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's pious? And then, of course, we're told you can substitute any other value, any other moral value, justice, goodness, beauty, and so on. And this is, this fundamental question about what we now call metaethics. That's to say, not what does morality require, but what kind of thing is morality? What kind of things are moral principles? And one answer, of course, the Platonic answer, the Socratic answer, is to say that moral principles objectively exist. They're things we discover or think our way up to. They're not the result of being made or decided upon or willed by any other being. And the opposing view, of course, is the reverse, that moral principles have to be the result of an act of will, either by a god or by human beings. And the important thing to see is that right from the beginning, in the Christian context, each of these views seem to pose very, very grave dangers to Orthodox religious belief. So the worry, if you took the rationalist Platonic sort of horn of the dilemma, is that you seem to be making God somewhat superfluous, at least in the realm of morality. You're saying that, as Grotius famously does, that the laws of nature, the laws of morality would be just what they are, what they were, even if there were no God. Right? They're objective, independently existing relations. You might also worry that they constrain the freedom of God, his omnipotence, insofar as if there's this freestanding objective set of moral principles that are to sort of govern his conduct because he's perfect. Doesn't that mean that he's in a sense dependent upon a moral standard outside of himself, which he can't change? So those were the worries about the rationalist answer, but the voluntarist answer, the one on the other side, to most people seemed even worse. Right? because the idea was if you say, no, morality is just whatever God says, then you seem to be turning God into a sort of arbitrary ruler whose laws can't be defended on the grounds that they're independently or antecedently just, good, or right. That is to say, you don't seem to have a distinctively moral reason any longer to do what God tells you, although of course you could have prudential reasons, and you could drop a house on you or something. So most theologians, as most of you will know, decided that much the better way to go in this debate was to take the rationalist path rather than the voluntarist path. And there are indeed shockingly few voluntarists and proper voluntarists in the Western tradition, or indeed in the Jewish tradition, or indeed in the Muslim tradition. But once you've taken the rationalist path, you end up confronting the problem of theodicy, that is to say, God's justice, because if God has to play by the same rules that we understand as a principle of justice, that he, being perfect, will unerringly conform himself to, we seem to encounter a problem, which is that we live in a world that is characterized by enormous amounts of evil and undeserved suffering. And of course, if you're an Orthodox Christian of this vintage, you also believe that the vast majority of the human race is damned. And you need to explain how a just God could have elected to create a world in which all of these things are the case. So that's the problem with theodicy. Of course, many people know that it's Leibniz who coins the term in 1710, but this debate had been going on for 1,500 years. So what do? Well, the most natural answer, you might think, and many people did, to the theodicy problem was to offer as the way out of it, or the solution to it, freedom. Right? That's to say, first of all, when we have to vindicate God's punitive justice, we can do so by saying that we're free. We always have it within our power not to sin. And if we have it within our power not to sin, and we do sin, then God is perfectly just in punishing us. That seems to be an attractive answer to the question of God's punitive justice. But okay, what about all the rest? The fact that human beings are the authors of a great deal of moral evil. We sin, and we produce terrible suffering amongst each other. We also have to confront huge amounts of natural evil, earthquakes, cancer, all the rest of it. How do you justify all of this? How do you square it with the hypothesis that it was all brought into being intentionally by an omnipotent and omnibenevolent, perfectly just being? Well, there too, freedom seemed like a promising answer. That's to say, what you could say is that the thing that has transcendent value is our capacity for morality. The fact that we're capable of freely choosing to do the right. But first of all, this answers the question why we tolerate, or God would have tolerated, moral evil, which is to say sin, leaving it as a possibility, because the possibility of doing wrong simply is a corollary of the ability that we have to freely choose the right. If we can't choose to sin, then there is no choice to be made. And this thing that has transcendent value, namely our freely choosing the right, our capacity for morality, would be a sham, would be a kind of burlesque. But also you might think, although you could never prove, that lots of the natural bads of the world can be vindicated this way, insofar as you might assume that without the sorts of natural forces that go into the production of earthquakes and cancer and all kinds of other things, there couldn't in the world also be creatures like us who are capable of morality, which is the thing that has transcendent value. So on all these different dimensions, freedom seemed to be a very attractive solution to the theodicy problem. But of course, the immediate reaction to this view, which tends to be called Pelagian or Pelagianism, after the late 4th or 5th century British ascetic, Roman British monk who defended some version of this, is that it offered a very dangerous sort of rival to Christian doctrine, understood correctly, because if it's true that we can't, that each person, on pain of God being unjust as a creator, must be and as judge, must be free at all times to choose not to sin, it's always within our power, then why is it that we needed the atonement, the crucifixion, and this sort of salvific intervention that's at the center of the Christian story, the Christian mystery? And so Augustine very famously rejects this view, right, and puts in its place his mature doctrine of original sin, which says no. Instead, we live under the bondage of sin, and we're incapable of freely choosing not to sin. Rather, what causes us not to sin is the intercession of grace, which comes irresistibly, as he came to think in his final works, to those God has mysteriously elected, and not to others. And that was to shore up the Orthodox Christian story. But of course, to his critics, it just seemed to aggravate the initial theodicy problem very, very badly, which is to say, now you've not only said that that we can't but sin, and therefore that God is going to punish us, even though counterfactually we couldn't have done otherwise, which seems tyrannical. But it turns out that this fact about us is itself a punishment for the sin of another person, namely Adam. And that sort of vicarious punishment seems to be unjust itself. And so there you have the dialectic that just ramifies throughout the subsequent history of the West. So my basic suggestion is that this cluster of commitments that come to be regarded as liberal were first defended by people who took the Pelagian side of this debate, who were trying to vindicate the idea, vindicate the justice of God by insisting on our freedom, our fundamental transcendental freedom, and argued that the proper response or the proper way of organizing societies made up of people like this, people whose great task in life is to sort of, as they always said, using the language of epic heroism and athleticism. I'm talking about people from Milton to Locke to Leibniz to Rousseau to Kant, Kant most spectacularly. We want to compete to win the garland. We each are on our private quest to fulfill our moral duty, to freely choose the right. There is no value that coerced right doing or coerced right belief has in the salvific scheme, and therefore we should live in a society that grants people religious toleration, various kinds of rights to do wrong, because the right to do wrong is absolutely necessary for the erection of an environment, a social environment in which we are left to the crucial task of freely choosing the right. So that is one picture. It emphasizes a highly sort of dignitarian view of human beings as choosers, metaphysically free, able at all times to choose to do the right, to be therefore meritorious or blameworthy, and all of this puts enormous pressure on traditional articles of faith within Christianity, most importantly the doctrine of the atonement, the doctrine of the Trinity, and so on, and indeed all of these people become anti-Trinitarians, and eventually sort of Socinians, Unitarians, and all the rest. But that's a picture, and I think it's a very important and powerful one that explains where all of this gets going. In closing, I want to juxtapose it with what goes under the name liberalism and political philosophy. Now, just by way of underlining how much disagreement there is within the sort of population of philosophers who have defended in some form the same basic set of institutions and practices. And this is all about the decisive intervention of John Rawls. And as we now know from the publication of his undergraduate senior thesis, Brief Inquiry upon the Meaning of Sin and Faith, the young Rawls, when he was an undergraduate, was a theologian. He was studying theology at Princeton and was in this kind of neo-Orthodox circle, and he planned to become an Episcopal priest. and his plans were very disrupted by the war when he went to the Pacific, and then his life takes on a very different trajectory. But it's very interesting to look at this earlier text in which Rawls is writing as a strident Augustinian, a strident anti-Pelagian, arguing that the view that human beings are free to choose to do right, to follow God's law, thereby to merit his election, is simply the sin of pride. As he says, it renders the cross of Christ to no effect, and it's to be rejected. Right? The idea of merit and earning, desert, and the kind of transcendental freedom that goes along with it. It's very interesting that one of his chief targets is Kant, for precisely this reason, the side of Kant that is Pelagian, the Kant of the noumenal realm. And in particular, he endorses the concept of original sin and the distinctive asymmetry that the doctrine of original sin gives us, which is that it's a kind of bifurcated anthropology. When we do bad things, right, we really are agents. That really is me when I sin, because my sin is fully attributable to myself because I'm a sinner, and it's not caused from outside because it's my spirit that's just depraved itself in some mysterious way. What needs to be explained, as it were, from outside is why a sinner like me would ever not sin, and the answer to that is grace. And Rawls explicitly accepts this entire picture in his sort of fascinating reconstruction of Christianity. And although he ceases to be an Orthodox Christian, by the time he gets to the theory of justice in 1971, he is arguing in exactly the same way, using the exact same language, against the possibility of merit, against the possibility of earning, which becomes the central commitment that underwrites the difference principle. That is his picture of why it is that the basic structure of society should only deviate from equality if deviations from equality will serve to make the least well off better off than an equal distribution would. And so what Rawls ends up defending, in addition to a highly redistributive set of conclusions based on the denial of the kind of agential capacities that earlier liberals or proto-liberals had taken to be absolutely basic to their project, but also the very idea of freedom. And I thought I would just leave you with this one nice little reflection of that. That is that although Rawls famously described his project as Kantian in inflection or inspiration, his Kant is a very different Kant, the Kant that he ends up inventing in the 1970s. And the actual Kant of Pelagianism, transcendental freedom, and the noumenal realm is one that he really has no time for. And his understanding of freedom is therefore much more compatibilist. That is, he is perfectly happy with the idea that freedom, to the extent we can talk about it meaningfully, must coincide with the fact that a great deal of what we choose to do is determined, if not all of it. So this is just a little vignette that just a couple of years after he writes The Theory of Justice, he annotates a copy, presumably because he was teaching it, of Kant's Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. And this particular edition was prefaced by an essay of John Silber's. And Silber, at one point when he's trying to offer a sort of précis of Kant's fundamental claim about the character of morality, says the following in Kant's name: a person capable of responsible action, that is to say, capable of being held accountable by a just God, must be free in the transcendental meaning of the term. Rawls circles the word transcendental and writes in the margin, this must, and he underlines must, this must surely be asking too much. But what is required? And later in the same essay, Silber summarizes Kant's essential claim about theodicy. He says, the moral quality of the will, again speaking for Kant, is completely self-acquired. No matter how bountifully or stepmotherly a human being is treated by nature, he is fundamentally the equal of, and his opportunities are basically the same as those of all other men in the development and expression of his moral personality. And below that sort of heavily underlined passage which he likewise marks with a question mark and 3 bars for emphasis. He writes, "It is hard to see how this can be true," underlining the word can. And in the margin right next to it, he just writes Pelagianism. This is all by way of saying, first of all, that when we talk about this thing called liberalism, we're talking about a motley of views that have very different anthropologies, metaphysical and philosophical commitments, and ethical commitments of all kinds. And that will bear on the question, to me anyway, of how able they are, as the question asks us to reflect on, of bearing the weight of the edifice, at least in the theoretical sense. That is, are they capable of producing a coherent commitment to these institutions and practices on the basis of the premises that they've introduced? And for me, anyway, I think in the case of the proto-liberals of the early modern period, the answer is yes, and in the case of Rawls and his followers, the answer is no, because the desire to be that Rawls clearly has, and that his disciples have, of being the particular kinds of dignitarian liberals they are, emphasizing autonomy and the essential character of choice, while still being fundamentally Augustinians in their rejection of the possibility of the relevant kind of human agency, seems to me a very deep incoherence that has produced lots of problems. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's just I tried every which way. Oh. So, except doing nothing.
Yes,
Okay.
I fixed it.
Okay.
So thank you very much for 3 truly extremely interesting presentations. It is now 10:53, exercising my free will and executive authority. Let's take a half an hour to ask questions and discuss what we've heard. We have a runner, so questions. You're supposed to run.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Is that bad? I'll do it. Not that bad.
Yes, thanks to all 3 of you for very interesting papers. And I wanted to ask Bryan Garsten about this interesting line that you're taking, that our liberalism is really founded on an acceptance of our being political rather than being apolitical. And the way we therefore, even if we tend to encroach very much on each other, giving ourselves space, we will create communities and connections that are very meaningful because of that political nature. What do you think about, and do you agree with this characterization of Aristotle's meaning of our being political, which is that we need human community to be fully perfected and developed and fulfilled, but we also need law, precisely because that fulfillment and perfection is so difficult and requires some constraint? Where does that leave the small communities that might be formed in the refuge away from the great community?
I think that's a good question. I think I would say that the liberal train of thought I was sort of thinking through puts less weight on that consideration. They do not think that we need the guidance of law or authority in the same way. I think it's possible to invent together. Yeah, I think that's one of the theoretical foundations, I guess I would say. But, in Aristotle too, there is more to say about this, right? Laws are given, but are also created. And both sides of law have to be considered. And so you could see liberals interested in the creation aspect. Again, I would also emphasize, I mean, I do think that's part of their commitment, but this line in Locke, when he's trying to respond to a similar sort of concerns, when he says people are not as apt to leave behind the forms they're used to as we think they are. I think that's important for liberals, too. They sort of assume that most of us, most of the time, do follow laws, norms, mores, because it's really impossible to constantly make things up for ourselves. So the real danger is less the absence of those laws than it is the stifling precedence of sort of the difference of practices.
I can always raise my hand and get the runner immediately because I put on the conference. Works out well. Yeah, thanks everybody. I just had a quick question, I think, for Eric about Pelagianism, which I confess to knowing very little about. So it makes sense to me that if you start from the assumption that God has to conform to our notions of justice, you find yourself immediately in this pickle, which I think you described nicely. On the one hand, it would seem to veer dangerously in the direction of straight-up atheism very quickly, insofar as it suggests that God is superfluous, as you put it, and his power limited. You could take the view that, in other words, God has to conform to our notions of justice to imply, well, the world, when you look at it, doesn't represent justice, and therefore God falls short. And so you have the problem of theodicy. I wonder, though, how do Pelagians resist getting sucked into the whirlpool which ends in something like atheism? By the way, I'm reminded Hume in the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Philo starts from the assumption that God has to conform to our notions of justice and ends with the conclusion that there is no just God, as you can see when you just look around at the world. In any event, here seems to be the difficulty, that if a Pelagian tries to justify God's morality in the face of the evils in the world, on the grounds that freedom has transcendent value, it seems to me they can take one or two paths at that point. They can say, okay, that's it. God gave us our freedom, and freedom's the best thing. Or, as it seems more probable to me if they are actually still a theologian, they will say, God gave us freedom, which we can use or misuse, and depending on our use or misuse, we will end up in heaven or hell. And if you add that next step, I don't think freedom is the transcendent value anymore, or the ultimate value anymore. It's rather the case, as it seems to me, that God is giving you the opportunity to deserve well of him. And the ultimate goal in all these cases, then, is to get to heaven and to avoid hell. Another way to put it is that when you still appeal to the kingdom of heaven, despite also insisting on the absolute value of freedom, you have this difficulty that how you make use of your freedom is going to be very dependent upon whether you believe there's a heaven and a hell. And if you don't have knowledge of whether there's a heaven and hell, and it seems that most of us don't, then you have to have faith or trust. And then it seems to me that you're back into anti-Pelagianism of some sort. God, in that case, is requiring us to simply have faith in something that we can't see with our own eyes. We simply have to believe. So it seems to me you have this dilemma. Either on the one hand, you are led towards atheism, Pelagianism would lead towards atheism, or it would lead back towards anti-Pelagianism.
Gosh, well, thank you. I mean, it's there's a huge amount in there. So let me just sort of say a couple of things, sort of nibbling around the edges. I mean, one is that first of all, when we talk about Pelagians and Pelagianism, there's already an enormous historical problem here, because Pelagius himself, actually we know we know much more about him now than early modern people did, not least because we have more of his corpus. So to the extent that people knew about Pelagius himself in the early modern period, they chiefly knew him through Augustine, I mean through the passages of Pelagius that Augustine excerpts in his anti-Pelagian writings, right? And Pelagian is even more complicated in the early modern period because it's a term of abuse, like Erastian or Democrat, or things like that. That's to say, no one says, "Hello, my name is Fred. I'm a Pelagian." That bastard over there is a Pelagian. So there are complexities here, and whether the views of these early modern figures match very well, or mesh very well with Pelagius's own views, is a very interesting question. My own sense, I'm rather the minority. I think they mesh pretty well, but Pelagius's own agenda was very different. What in the context of late antiquity, what Pelagians were doing was saying, look, this is about the possibility of perfectibility, right? That we can build a virtuous, a virtuous church, a virtuous Christian community, and that we have it within our power to lead sinless lives, effectively sinless lives. And that's why you should do things like give all of your property to the poor, and so actually it was a sort of a movement of social perfectibility, but it needed the metaphysics to make sense of itself. At least that was the idea. Does rationalism lead to atheism? So I said that God, the worry is that God is rendered superfluous in the realm of morality, which is different from saying superfluous, right? And they were all very now. Of course, there's a great debate about this, but what virtually any theologian, insofar as almost all of them are rationalists. I mean, even by the way, Augustine is not a voluntarist. Right? I mean, that's clear. Augustine's view is, and this is even true of Calvin, who is not a voluntarist, which is to say that they say, well, yes, there's original sin, and yes, we're saved only through, at least late Augustine, only through absolutely unmerited, irresistible grace, and God determines who is elect and who is not, but he doesn't do this arbitrarily. He must do it for a reason, even though the reason is opaque to us, right? We can't understand. But we have to assume there is a reason, because if there were really no reason, he would run afoul of the basic principle of justice. So even those guys are not jumping over into voluntarism the way someone like Hobbes does, right? One of the true, proper, echt voluntarists. So first of all, what they would say is that still leaves a lot of room for God, right? God is still lawgiver. He's still judge. He's still creator, right? So to say that moral principles are objective and universal is to say that to the extent that any world of this kind existed, these principles would apply. But it doesn't follow that the world needed to exist. Right, so the idea is that, so what the people in question would say, to varying different degrees, is we're leaving quite a lot of room for God. We're just making the case that morality can't be grounded in His will. So that's their response. Whether it's satisfactory or not satisfactory is obviously it is a sort of deep question. But you asked another really interesting question about faith and about reason, because you're exactly right. The momentum of this view is historically, it seems to me, is not toward atheism, but it is toward rational religion. That is, because for the same reason, just extend the argument. So if a just God couldn't punish me for sinning if I couldn't but sin, then it also looks like a just God couldn't punish me for sinning if I couldn't know that what I was doing was a sin, right? So either we all have to know at all times what sin is, or God has to, as it were, grade on a curve, which is Locke's view, right? I mean, in the Reasonableness of Christianity, which is that sort of, he will demand, as he says, of each what he's been from each what he's been given. So if you haven't heard the gospel yet, and you abide by that share of the moral law that's intelligible to you, just qua human being, you make use of what he calls the candle of the Lord, right? Which is partial. You get full credit. I mean, you should be saved. Even though Locke argues that it's only the gospel, and you needed revelation in order to have access epistemically to the entirety of the moral law, right? His image is rather like, it's rather like, imagine a kind of mathematical proof of immense complexity. You have to be given the solution, and then you can work your way backwards and figure out why it works, but you would never have gotten there on your own, right? So it's rational, so Christianity, let's say, is rational, but by rational he doesn't mean accessible to unaided reason. He just means capable of being shown to be rational once we've had revelation. So that kind of argument, these people are becoming more and more committed to it as the 17th century turns into the 18th, until you get to Rousseau and Kant, who effectively argue that on pain of injustice, God must make the entirety of the moral law, that is to say, the entirety of the basis on which he is going to judge us, available to our unaided reason. And so you're absolutely right. That's the momentum of the argument.
Well, thanks for 3 great papers. As I think both Bryan and Eric intimated, there's a bit of a tension between the question that Dustin and Arthur posed and the answers being given by the panel. So the question referred to, liberalism as an edifice whose foundations can be identified, but the panel then gave us, multiple liberalisms, 3 liberalism of rights, a liberalism of refuge from oppression, and a liberalism of free moral choice. And I think the point of the metaphor in the question is that the foundations are cracking, and that we're supposed to theorize liberalism with a view to trying to identify those cracks and maybe figure out how to patch them up. I mean, the foundation are cracking in the sense that there's faltering commitment to liberalism in various ways, both in the United States and in other countries in Europe that a few years ago seemed to have a pretty reliable commitment to liberalism, and that's much less, those commitments seem much less strong now. So the question is, if there isn't one edifice, there's multiple edifices. So how do we try and figure out where the cracks are? If there's one edifice and you know what the foundations are, and you see where the cracks are, you can try and patch up the cracks. But if there's multiple liberalisms, how are we supposed to address the challenges to liberalism that we see both here and other parts of the world? I'm not sure that's an answer to the question. I'll just put it on the table.
I should
No, I'm sorry. I was part of my contract.
There's maybe not that much difference in the 3 versions of liberalism. I didn't hear anything I disagreed with, actually, from Bryan. I might ask him whether the choice we have between liberals and conservatives is a choice that one party can offer a refuge from the other.
Had enough.
Question mark. So, yeah, see what you mean. That might be adaptable to as to theodicy, I think that has to be understood as a disguise. So I don't see how you can argue for free moral choice if it's the case that somebody can say, with authority to enforce it, that he speaks with God, and you don't. So that's what revelation is, essentially. Yes. He said of that Savonarola was able to convince the people of Florence. So that liberalism is essentially atheist, but it has a disguise of theodicy or concern with religion, and it's also essentially a form of religion which has a disguise of representation.
Can I say briefly, I would see the party system that way, although these days I would like to find a refuge from both of them. Ronnie, this question, look, I think it's an open question whether the discontents driving people towards modes of politics that are illiberal, how much of those discontents arise from the nature of liberalism itself. I think we have to identify very clearly. You know, I have children, and often they will complain about something, but the real problem is that they haven't eaten in 4 hours. And so people's identification of the source of their discontent isn't always the best indicator of what the real source is. That's not to deny the questions about liberalism that we're all interested in. But I would say, in the spirit of identifying different versions of liberalism, there is one sort that claims to be above politics somehow, or an end to politics, and people resent that because they know it's not true. They know that there are, in fact, answers that liberals provide to big questions. So I favor the forms of liberalism that are more openly political and that are ways of managing politics rather than trying to end it or move beyond it somehow. And I think that helps because at least it might seem a little bit less hypocritical. The charge of hypocrisy is one that's often launched against liberalism, and it's justified. So I don't know, those are a few things to come to.
Can I just say one thing as well? I mean, I think it's a really good question, and part of my sense of just sort of down payment on a claim I can't possibly defend at the moment is that that liberalism has this character to an unusual degree amongst its competitor ideologies. That's to say that that it has been defended. I mean, that the intellectual routes to it and the way in which people defend it and the reason that people are committed to it are very, very different. We didn't even begin to exhaust. So we haven't talked about utilitarianism. I mean, you say you have utilitarian liberals. You have Augustinian liberals, by the way. The people in the tradition of Niebuhr and I would say Jules Sklar, liberalism of fear, which begins from exactly opposite premises, right? So we take the idea that we're fallen, degraded, and therefore incapable of being trusted to rule each other in an untrammeled way without inflicting terrible suffering. And so the sheer panoply of different fundamental comprehensive views and metaphysical and religious commitments that cause different people to defend the same basic sort of institutions is in some ways, I think, a blessing because it produces a big tent, in a way that gives us some hope that it can continue to maintain itself. But I think it also introduces, particularly at certain moments, a great deal of, a sort of a particular set of challenges, which is to say, when liberalism is about restraint and about deciding not to pursue, let's say, one's own fundamental conception, without limit, to accept a certain kind of denial of a sense of wholeness or organicism or the world being just right. And you have to explain why we're making that sacrifice. People need a reason. And to the extent that we have enormous differences of opinion about what the reason is, that's a challenge. That's to say, that's shifting from the first construal of the question that I gave to the second. That is, so we're talking about, can liberalism work as a coherent theory? Well, that depends what the theory is and which kind of liberalism it is. But can it work as a public philosophy? What are its challenges as a public philosophy? I think this is a major one, which is that everyone who is a sort of integralist, both of them, are integralists for the same basic reason, right? People who are communists for sort of the same. Without denying the extraordinary heterogeneity and factionalism that exists within communism, I don't think it's quite to this extent, and I think that's a challenge, and I think it's part of the to the extent that people lose faith in liberalism. I think it's partly because we're not explaining to them what the urgent interest is, apart from simply sort of consequential arguments about stability and things like that, but what the moral reason or the sort of compelling human reasons we might have for this kind of political forbearance are. So I think that is a legitimate challenge, precisely because of the unusually sort of complex nature of the landscape of people who call themselves liberals.
Last night, Bryan posed this question of, why is the tenor of these debates so much different than it was in the 90s when it had a kind of gentility to it? And I think you may have answered that question with your talk this morning, which was beautiful, I thought, this idea of refuge. I think there's a perception that the sort of liberal establishment has become highly illiberal in precisely the sense of liberalism that you offer, the sense of the forbearance, to use the word Melzer just offered, doesn't seem to be much evident in the kind of progressive mindset. There's a sense of an aggressive sort of remoralization of the private sphere, under the rubric of anti-sexism, anti-racism, etc. And Eric Nelson's paper helped us with he kind of Rawls as an anti-Pelagian, and sort of showing the theological underbelly of liberalism, I think helps to ground the sense many people have of a kind of quasi-totalitarian turn. I mean, it's an overwrought kind of way to put it, but that the kind of progressive establishment is precisely determined to kind of eliminate any sites of refuge or shelter from the project.
I agree with that. But it's also true, as I think Devin Stauffer pointed to last night, that each side seems to see itself as playing defense. So the liberal establishment sees itself as somehow on the defensive, and the right, as Harvey Mansfield pointed out this morning, sees itself as on the defensive. so I'm not, so there's also just a strategic, practical matter of how to break that. It's like,
I think I have the one.
I know I am.
You are a
I know I
skeptic.
am, but I think that means I can speak.
So I just had a question for Bryan. I just want you to reflect on a question that I was reflecting on as you were talking. If we think of liberalism in terms of refuge, as you sketched, the question that was in my mind is, how well is that played out? If we think of it as just the course of things in light of that notion, and I don't mean it as a rhetorical question, the answer to which is it's played out very bad. I mean it in this sense. It seems to me very my own initial thought, and you probably have more of a thought because this was just what first occurred to me, is that it's played out in a very mixed way. On the one hand, liberalism certainly has offered a refuge for many people, both people who've come to liberal societies from illiberal ones and for dissenters within liberal societies. And as myself, the child of an immigrant who came from an illiberal society, I certainly appreciate that liberalism made, in a sense, my own life possible in that way. And so it has offered a refuge in many respects. On the other hand, as you sketched it, the ideal would be something like this: robust communities within liberalism itself that treat with magnanimity sub-communities that are full of strong, vigorous individuals who live outside the dominant communities by which they're treated with magnanimity. And I don't think that's what we have. So in that sense, it doesn't seem to me liberalism has fully lived up to what one might hope for if one thought of it in terms of this ideal of communities on the one hand giving refuge on the other.
I think that's a fair question and a fair worry. I'm not sure. We need to think about it a bit. But I would just point to, I think the tendency of the question, which is, again, to using the word liberalism again, and to think of it as a kind of self-sufficient system on its own, whereas, Michael Melzer wrote an article a few years ago on the word liberal as an adjective, which I liked. I don't think he identified, to my satisfaction, exactly the meaning of the adjective. So that's what I've tried to do here. But I think liberals offer responses to these problems that come up in all sorts of political communities. And so the character of different liberal communities will be different. But they will have this feature in common. But if we try to make of refuge, an orienting principle around which a whole society is built, I think it's not enough for that. It's too empty. It will draw on the society. Liberals will have to draw on the society in which they find themselves. So again, there may be other. So we are talking about liberal democracies, and to reference something that you mentioned last night, I think with Tocqueville that many of the concerns that are being voiced about liberalism are in fact due to the democratization and the enthusiastic love of equality that Tocqueville talks about, including the dissolution of families, churches, and so on, which has more to do, I think, with the suspicion of hierarchy and authority of all different kinds than with this offering of refuge.
So the trouble with liberalism of fear is that it's too negative.
Yes.
Like Marseille understood as a refuge from a storm, and not as a new city.
Right.
Yeah, which is something positive. So maybe you're closer to Montesquieu. Well, you could say your remarks are based on Montesquieu, mine on Locke.
But you also mentioned Tocqueville, and maybe Tocqueville is an even better expression. It was because Morton proceeds to have the kind of liberalism of fear that Judith Sklar was certainly appealing to when she spoke of a liberalism of fear. The storm that the sailors are escaping from is of someone's ambition, unchecked ambition.
Right, I wanted to move from thinking of seeking refuge to thinking about offering.
I'd like finally to build on a comment that Bryan made. It could be that our disagreements here are all based on the fact that we're hungry. So let's get some lunch. Lauren, what do we have to do?
Walk that way.
Walk that way.
Seems doable.
Please join me in thanking our panel for a very, very interesting discussion.